Thank you, Mark. I really appreciated the opportunity to be here today to open the Criminal Justice Symposium and to welcome you all here, I guess, as part of the conversation that Mark's already indicated will be continuing, I guess, beyond today. Like David and ahead of Songwoman Maruchi's Welcome to Country, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today and to pay my respects to elders past, present and future for the very important role that they do undertake as custodians of the land. When Mark first approached me last year with the proposal to partner with Endeavour Foundation, amongst others, in hosting a criminal justice symposium, and particularly focusing it, I guess, on issues impacting people with intellectual disability, I was immediately interested. Like Mark, I've got a fairly long history of working in the disability services industry, starting in the frontline service delivery as a support worker and teacher aide with the autism, whatever it was then, but now Autism Queensland, well over, I think, about 20 odd years ago now. As development of the symposium progressed, I was extremely pleased to see my own interest reflected in the interest of others who were also partnering with us in pulling this forum together. Furthermore, as the program for the symposium evolved, it became increasingly clear that this is a topic that captures the hearts and minds of many. So yes, the program allows us to hear from eminent speakers who've come from near and far, and I welcome the expertise that they'll bring to the room. However, I'd also like to acknowledge, and I think Mark was alluding to this earlier, that the expertise isn't just limited to those who are coming here to present across the next 2 days, but is in fact held by us all. Now let's see if this works. I love that. With this in mind, I encourage you to share your knowledge with others over the course of the time that we are here, to make connections, and to consider how you might engage in the future with those who you meet, to pursue the common interests that bring us here today. Everyone who's here today has come with that interest, and it's testament, I think, to the importance accorded to promoting and pursuing access to justice for people with intellectual disability. From my side of things, particularly those who have impaired decision-making capacity. I have no doubt that the presentations that we will be privy to and the discussions that will ensue over the next 2 days will add to the currency of our understanding, particularly with respect to those issues that bring us here. And I think the essence of those being not just about those who come before the criminal justice system as perpetrators of crime, but also those who are victims of crime. This understanding will be of significant value to enabling a strategy to take us forward in our endeavours to promote ongoing improvements. It always throws me when they start taking photos. to promote ongoing improvements to the way that Queensland supports people with disability who engage with the criminal justice system. As Public Advocate for Queensland, I'm responsible for promoting and protecting the autonomy, rights and participation of Queensland adults with impaired decision-making capacity. This is primarily undertaken through statutory systems advocacy. As David referred to earlier, like Mark, I'm responsible for causing trouble. I have the unique opportunity of being paid by government to point out those areas of legislation or policy or practice that isn't necessarily upholding rights in the way that it should. It's an interesting role to have. It's certainly an interesting time to be in the role, I'll say that much. But certainly within this role, access to justice has been a clear priority since we first started exploring the issues that we were going to pursue. Through our work, we estimate there may be up to 113,000 adults with impaired decision-making capacity in Queensland. This includes both people with intellectual disability, but it may also include people with mental illness, people who misuse substances, or people with ageing conditions such as dementia. There's probably also a myriad of other conditions that potentially could lead to someone having impaired decision-making capacity, given that it's situation-specific and point-in-time specific. Many people with impaired capacity also face multiple disadvantages and, as a result, often interact with multiple service systems. Importantly, this means that each person's experience is different, and that we cannot automatically assume that what works for one person will also work for another. However, this should not prevent us from looking at the systemic issues that require attention to enable opportunities for individual outcomes to be realised. I often reflect on how best to undertake the responsibilities of my role as public advocate. One of the things that I think challenges me most is that sometimes it feels like we're still fighting many of the very same battles that we were fighting back when I started in this sector back in the 90s. However, despite over 20 years working in the disability services sector, I remain an eternal optimist. which is kind of fortunate given the role that I'm in and the environmental context in which I'm undertaking it. I share this with you because my approach is sometimes perceived as naivety, when in fact it's more about me having a never say die attitude. For example, some of the ideas that I'll put on the table over the course of my discussion today are fairly simple ones, and yet surprisingly difficult to achieve. One of the greatest challenges that I believe we face is that it's highly unlikely that the systems that we've inherited will ever be fully unpacked and put back together in a way that addresses the causal factors that truly address the issues at hand. In many respects, we need to assume that our work will remain challenged by the complexity and fragmentation that is inherent both within and across the different service systems, both human services side of things as well as criminal justice systems, and that the interaction between those will continue to be complex. This complexity is not just evident within Queensland, but is certainly there across many, if not all, jurisdictions within Australia, and also in many jurisdictions internationally as well. With this in mind, although systems advocacy is often focused on advocating for change at a top-down level, my approach is somewhat more pragmatic and recognises that sometimes the most effective solutions are those that are pursued from the bottom up. Hence, I think why Mark and I seem to get along so well. Increasingly, I'm seeking to effect change by encouraging buy-in at multiple levels. Or in other words, for those who might know Kotter's approach to project management, by creating a sense of urgency, and by doing this at all levels that are potentially relevant to the situation at hand. The more we open people's eyes to the essence of the issue, the more we increase understanding about those things that perpetuate the issue, the more likely we are to see practice change that over time may well lead to incremental systems change. When I first came into this role in August 2012, which some days feels like only yesterday and other times feels so long ago, it was difficult to know where to start, given the range and breadth of issues that are impacting adults with impaired capacity in Queensland. However, as I began to engage with the sector, as I began to have the conversations, meet round tables, start to unpack, I guess, some of the things that were evident within the systems that we, engage with on a regular basis, it became increasingly evident that there were a number of areas that could benefit from a more robust evidence base. An evidence base that we could draw upon, that we could build upon, that we could add to, I guess, in the course of our work. And in doing so, create a foundation from which to advocate for the kinds of changes that we believe to be necessary. In many respects, that evidence base is vital to promoting the policy change that might be required, the program change that might be required, the practice change that might be required, to be able to point to it and say, this is why, we've unpacked it, we understand it more. These are the things that are contributing to the very issues that we see currently existing within our community. And in doing so, we have the opportunity to promote improved life outcomes for those people with intellectual disability or mental illness or ageing with dementia who have impaired capacity and who require those changes to be effected. In considering the functions for which I hold responsibility, in particular that of protecting and promoting rights, the issue of access to justice for adults with impaired capacity was clearly one that would benefit from increased attention. Since that time, my office has engaged in a variety of different project work, submission writing, and general research activities focused on enhancing our understanding of those issues. Building on that research, and I think adding to that evidence base in many respects, has been the opportunity to contribute to a number of inquiries that have been put out there at both the federal as well as state level, which has been a really unique, I think, opportunity in recent years. I guess I speak with only recent experience in this role, of course, but there seems to have been an increasing number of inquiries over this past 18 months relevant to people with impaired capacity, and it has presented a really useful opportunity for us to, use that research to enhance other people's understanding and to contribute to recommendations at both the Senate level in the federal space, but also here at the state level. And see some of the subtle changes and shifts that have occurred as a result. Central to our work has been a focus on identifying how best to ensure that people with impaired capacity are afforded respect for their intrinsic dignity and individual autonomy, and that they are supported to fully and actively participate in all aspects of community life and in decision-making regarding their individual circumstances. This is particularly relevant when addressing forensic matters for a person with impaired capacity, given the need to strike a balance between an individual's right to the greatest degree of autonomy, the individual's right to adequate and appropriate support in their decision-making, and to their protection from neglect, abuse and exploitation when the nature of their impairment limits them from looking after their own interests. And while civil rights and community protection are important principles that play an integral part in the evolution of society, we must not forget the individual rights of those who may be challenged in their understanding of and or ability to engage with societal norms and legal frameworks. If someone doesn't understand those things that are the rules, I guess, that exist to guide behaviour in the form of law or whatever it might be, then how do we expect them to adhere to them? This is not to say that people with impaired capacity should be free to do what they want when they want, but rather that we need to ensure that appropriate support is provided when it is needed, preferably before a person comes into contact with the criminal justice system. So how do we turn the system around? How do we encourage government to look at the linkage between the criminal justice systems and the social service systems? And then how do we pursue a shift in the way that public monies are spent to more proactively address the disadvantage that often underpins a person's contact with the criminal justice system? It's probably the busiest slide I managed. The notion of justice reinvestment is not a new one. In fact, it was the focus of a Senate inquiry in early 2013 and underpins justice reforms in numerous jurisdictions, both nationally and internationally. People with impaired capacity are a particularly vulnerable group of individuals for whom targeted criminal justice reinvestment strategies could help address social exclusion and disadvantage while enhancing opportunities to participate both economically and socially. However, to be effective, a justice reinvestment framework must look across systems, not just on the criminal justice system itself. It must seek to identify and mitigate against the causal factors and underpinning risks for people with impaired capacity at all critical contact points. This should include community education and awareness strategies, as well as risk mitigation strategies that target known demographic indicators. These indicators are not always personal ones. For example, as many of you will know, even postcodes can be an identifier of risk. However, to be effective, there needs to be a complementary investment at all stages. It's about that early intervention. It's about making sure supports and strategies are put in place for someone when there are known risk factors, I guess, that might indicate the potential for them to come into contact with the system. But aligning with that in terms of looking at the way that we reinvest monies, it's also about ensuring that we have money invested at the pre-offence stage, at the post-offence stage and at the post-release levels. It's about making sure we're hitting every one of those marks, but increasingly over time, I guess starting to pull it back and further as we get the understandings that we need, pull it back to that understanding of as much as we can in that early intervention space. Unfortunately, I think the challenge exists that it would require almost double the amount of money by any government to literally put the money that was required into early intervention because of where we're at in terms of the evolution of criminal justice currently. Having said that, that shouldn't defeat us. We need to focus not just on what a particular individual may require, but also how the community can support or be supported to address the underlying factors that perpetuate risk and or that lead to a lack of cohesion in the way that the systems of support operate. It became increasingly evident through our work that the current system in Queensland, and this will come as no surprise to any of you, does not necessarily provide an optimal level of cohesion or simplicity. An understatement of the day. In deliberating cases involving people with impaired capacity, we often see a complex interaction of numerous legislative instruments, all trying to be put together in the right way to try and, do what they're supposed to do and get the outcome for the person. However, it's similarly apparent that the limitations of each of the current legislative instruments have resulted in them being applied in a manner that doesn't necessarily accord with the intention behind their development and implementation. For example, in late 2012, I was invited to provide comment on a particular case that had come before the Mental Health Court. The individual central to this case had a string of charges and alleged offences that took considerable time to wade through. I think the file that I got stood about this high. double-sided. Of even greater interest, however, was that the nature of this person's situation had led to 4 different legislative instruments. Let me think about it now, the Mental Health Act, the Forensic Disability Act, the Guardianship and Administration Act and the Disability Services Act, all being applied across 3 different service systems in seeking to address issues that, arguably, might never have arisen if the person had been provided with appropriate support many, many years ago when they first came to the attention of government and the human services system. And you could see that pattern as I read through this file. You could see that pattern. You could see when that contact was first there, and you could see the need that was first there. And I mean, hindsight is always 20/20, as we know, but you look at that and you think, if only. Unfortunately for this particular person, just like in so many other cases, the person had become the problem. Too often I hear similar stories of how people who are trying desperately to access the support that they need fall through the cracks in the system. Too often I've worked with individuals and families where I've seen the impact of this firsthand as people spiral progressively into crisis. Too often I hear examples of how the system itself fails people. Too often I see a lack of acknowledgement for people's rights and/or a lack of support to enable people to enact these rights. Being able to uphold human rights and in doing so safeguard choice, control, person's well-being requires us to not only understand the challenges inherent within the systems, but to generate successful strategies to navigate the systems in a manner that enables us to facilitate outcomes that meet the needs of those we represent. One of the things that I'm passionate about is rebuilding supportive communities. When I first came to the disability services sector 20 odd years ago, there was a really strong sense of community. If things weren't working, families got together to try and deal with it or fix it or find a way around it. If families weren't able to do that, they engaged with the local community, with service providers, with community members, with council members, and they banded together to try and solve it. Over time, that sense of community has become increasingly eroded. Part of that, and I certainly won't cast all the blame on that, but part of that came about, I think, with the introduction of individualised funding. Suddenly those families who were used to working collaboratively with each other were in competition with each other. Who's going to get the money? My case has got to be worse than their case because that way I'm going to get up first. And that, I think that unfortunate, that's one of it, certainly not the only reason, but that unfortunate circumstance has progressively led to that erosion. I think part of it's also been the way that community has evolved. Many people don't even know the name of their neighbour. It's that thing of, how do you create and strengthen community if you don't have that sense of community in the place that you reside? I'm keen to look at how we fill the gaps inherent in the system and how we promote the ways that individuals, families, organisations, service providers, local governments, state governments can work together to generate effective and sustainable solutions. However, we need to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. If we want to promote cohesion and integration in the human services system, then we need to work together ourselves in a way that's both cohesive and integrated. One of the most effective tools that I believe we hold is the collective strength, for instance, of those sitting in the room today, but also of those who've been unable to come today, but who are out there in the system doing the work. But that collective strength that comes from working together, particularly to the extent that it enables us to be strategic about our approach to key issues. We need to identify our respective strengths. We need to build upon each other's efforts in a way that facilitates that improvement and that integration. Regardless of our focus or our approach, we each have a role to play in responding not only to the issues impacting particular individuals at particular points in time, but also to highlight the way in which the systems as they are currently designed and/or the way that they operate fail to uphold rights or facilitate successful outcomes. In the work that we do in my office, although we don't have a role in individual advocacy, many of the stories that we hear or the contact that we get revolves around an issue impacting a particular individual. What we look for as we, behind that issue is what are the systems issue? Where does that roll up? Where was the failure or the challenge in the system that led to the person experiencing whatever it is that brought them to calling our office? We also need to ensure that any proposals for change, whether at an individual or at a systems level, are presented in a way that is both pragmatic and effective. We need to think ahead to the obstacles that we might encounter. We need to develop the counter-arguments that we're going to need to address those obstacles that people might put before us. We also need to think ahead to the counter-arguments that other people are going to present to the solutions that we might put on the table, particularly when they're seeking to utilise those as a rationale for why the proposal we're laying them cannot be implemented. We need to create that sense of urgency that I referred to earlier. We need to give people the information that they need to not only understand the issue, but also to understand how maintaining the status quo serves to perpetuate the issue, if not make it worse. It's the shared responsibility of government, community and industry at all levels to generate the necessary infrastructure to ensure that people with disability are able to access and contribute to community as citizens with the same rights as those without disability. No matter that the battle may sometimes seem to be an uphill one, we need to persevere and seek the change that we know to be necessary. In closing, I'd like to congratulate Endeavour Foundation, and in particular, I think Mark and Nagadeva, who I think came up with the idea, sitting around no doubt having a coffee or something medicinal, on assembling a program that will serve to challenge and stimulate our thinking over the coming 2 days. Once again, welcome to you all. As I mentioned in my opening words, this conference presents an opportunity for us all to not only learn from each other, but to engage as colleagues with shared interests and to leave here with a collective strength that will facilitate effective and sustainable change. Thank you.